No one was supposed to be in that room. The soft click of the suite door echoed through the silence as Alexander Hayes stepped inside, loosening his tie after a 14-hour day that had been measured in contracts, numbers, and decisions worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. The penthouse lights responded automatically, casting a warm amber glow across marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but something felt off immediately. Something subtle yet impossible to ignore, like the air itself had shifted, and then he saw them. A woman, curled slightly on the edge of his bed, her body angled protectively around a small child, both of them asleep as if the world outside had simply ceased to exist. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe properly, because nothing about this made sense. This was a private suite secured by layers of security, a space designed to keep the world out, not invited in, yet here they were, fragile and real against Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than most monthly rents. His first instinct should have been anger, a call to security, a demand for answers, but it didn't come. Instead, his gaze caught on details he couldn't ignore. The woman's shoes placed neatly by the side of the bed, worn at the soles, her coat folded beneath the baby like a makeshift cushion, the child's tiny hand gripping a corner of fabric, as if even in sleep she understood how easily comfort could disappear. The city hummed faintly beyond the glass, a distant reminder of the world he controlled so effortlessly. Yet inside this room, control felt irrelevant, almost meaningless. He took a slow step forward, careful, deliberate, as if any sudden movement might shatter something invisible, and the baby stirred, a soft sound escaping her lips, not quite a cry, more like a question whispered into the dark. The woman responded instantly, even in sleep, her arm tightening around the child, her face softening in a way that spoke of exhaustion deeper than fatigue, the kind that settled into bones and stayed there. Alexander's jaw tightened, not from irritation, but from something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in years, and he couldn't quite name it. He had built his life on precision, on keeping emotion at a distance, on understanding that every action had a cost and every decision required detachment. Yet standing there, watching a stranger protect her child with nothing but instinct and love, those rules felt strangely incomplete. A faint cough from the baby broke the silence again, sharper this time, and Alexander's eyes flicked toward the nightstand, toward the untouched bottled water, toward the untouched luxury that surrounded them. And for the first time that day, his thoughts weren't about mergers or market shares, but about something far simpler, far more human. Behind him, the faint buzz of his phone began to vibrate, persistent, demanding, the world reminding him of who he was supposed to be, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, he stood there, in a room that belonged entirely to him, realizing that somehow, without permission, without warning, two strangers had entered it and changed the atmosphere completely, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want them gone. The silence stretched longer than it should have until a sharp knock broke it, firm and controlled, the kind that belonged to someone used to being obeyed. And before Alexander could respond, the door opened just enough for the hotel manager to step inside, her posture stiffening the moment she noticed him standing there instead of the empty room she expected. Her eyes shifted, scanning, and then widened when they landed on the woman and child on the bed, the shock barely concealed behind professional training. And in that split second, Alexander saw exactly what would happen next: the call to security, the removal, the embarrassment, the quiet way problems were erased in places like this. But before she could speak, he raised a single hand, subtle yet absolute, and her voice stopped before it began. "Sir, I was informed that," she started carefully, lowering her tone as if the sleeping pair could hear through exhaustion, but Alexander's gaze did not leave the bed. "No one touches them," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying more authority than volume ever could, and the manager hesitated, caught between protocol and the reality of who stood in front of her. "They are not authorized to be here," she tried again, softer this time, as if searching for permission to do what she had been trained to do. But Alexander finally turned his head, just enough for his expression to meet hers, and whatever she saw there made her straighten instantly. "Then, consider this authorization," he replied, and that was the end of it. the unspoken understanding settling into place as she nodded once, quietly retreating without another word, closing the door with a gentleness that had not been there before. The room fell silent again, but it felt different now, less like an intrusion and more like a secret being protected, and Alexander exhaled slowly, unaware until that moment that he had been holding tension in his shoulders. He moved closer, not toward the woman directly, but toward the side of the room, lowering himself into a chair across from the bed, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if entering a space that required respect rather than ownership. From here, he could see more clearly the faint lines of exhaustion on her face, the way her hand rested protectively over the child's back even in sleep, the small details that spoke louder than any explanation, and he found himself studying them not out of curiosity, but out of something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to empathy. His phone vibrated again, persistent, flashing with notifications that carried weight in any other moment. Decisions waiting, people expecting, but the sound felt distant now, like it belonged to another version of him, one that existed outside this room. He silenced it without looking, his attention drawn instead to a simple object partially visible near the edge of the bed. A worn photograph tucked into the side of the woman's bag, the corner peeking out just enough to catch his eye, and, before he could stop himself, he leaned forward slightly, just enough to make out the image, a younger version of the same woman standing beside an older lady, both smiling in a way that felt genuine, unguarded, and something about it struck him unexpectedly, a quiet reminder of a time he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The baby shifted again, this time her tiny fingers brushing against the edge of the blanket before reaching outward, searching, and without thinking, Alexander extended his hand slightly, not fully, just enough for her to find it, and when her small hand wrapped around his finger, the contact was so light it should have meant nothing, yet it anchored him in a way he could not explain, grounding him in a moment that required nothing except presence. He did not pull away, did not react, simply remained there, still and silent, as if moving might break something fragile, and for the first time in years, the weight of everything he owned, everything he controlled, everything he had built, felt insignificant compared to the quiet trust of a child who did not even know who he was. Emily Carter woke not with a start, but with a slow, disoriented breath, the kind that came from sleeping too deeply after too many nights without rest, her eyes blinking against the soft light as her mind struggled to understand where she was, because this was not the cold bench, not the dim hallway, not any place she had learned to expect, and then reality returned all at once, sharp and unforgiving. Her body tensing as she became aware of the bed beneath her, the unfamiliar room, the silence. That felt too expensive to belong to her world, and most of all, the presence nearby. Her gaze snapped forward and landed on him, and for a brief second, neither of them moved. Alexander Hayes remained seated, composed, his hands still loosely held by the tiny fingers of Lily Carter, who continued sleeping peacefully, unaware that the moment had shifted, that the fragile balance had changed, and Emily's breath caught in her throat, panic rising not because of what he had done, but because of what he had not done, because she was still here, still inside a place she knew she should never have entered. She pulled herself upright too quickly, her voice trembling before it could form words. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to. I thought the room was empty. The door was open. I just needed somewhere for her to rest. I will leave right now." The sentences rushing out of her as if speed alone could fix the mistake, her hands already reaching for Lily, her movements careful but urgent, driven by a fear she knew too well, the fear of being told she did not belong. Alexander did not stand immediately, did not interrupt, did not raise his voice, and that alone slowed her down more than any command could have. Instead, he gently eased his finger free from Lily's grip, making sure not to wake her, before finally rising to his feet, his posture straight but not imposing, his expression steady in a way that did not match the situation she expected. "When was the last time you slept?" he asked, and the question did not fit. Not here, not now, not when she was bracing for consequences, and Emily hesitated, confusion breaking through her panic as she searched his face for some hidden meaning, some delayed reaction. But there was none, only quiet attention. "I am fine," she replied quickly, though her voice betrayed her, thin and unconvincing, her arms tightening around Lily as if preparing to be told to leave at any second. And Alexander's gaze shifted briefly to the child, then back to her, not judging, not dismissing, simply observing in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. "That is not what I asked," he said, still calm, and the steadiness of his tone made it harder to deflect, harder to pretend, and Emily swallowed, her shoulders dropping just slightly under the weight of the question, the truth pressing closer than she intended to let it. "I do not remember," she admitted quietly, the words barely above a whisper, and for a moment, the room held that answer, simple yet heavy, more revealing than any explanation she could have given. Alexander nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear, and instead of stepping aside to let her leave, he moved toward the small table near the window, picking up a bottle of water and placing it within her reach without making it feel like charity, without turning it into something she would have to refuse out of pride. And that small action, so controlled and deliberate, shifted something inside her, not trust, not yet, but something close enough to make her pause. The city lights flickered beyond the glass, distant and indifferent, while inside the room, the air felt different now, no longer just a place she had entered by mistake, but a moment that was unfolding in a way she could not predict. And for the first time since she opened her eyes, Emily did not rush toward the door, because something in the way he stood there, composed and quiet, suggested that leaving was no longer the only option. Emily's fingers hesitated around the bottle, not because she did not need it, but because accepting anything in a place like this always came with a cost she could not afford, her eyes flicking from the water to Alexander and back again as if the answer might be written somewhere between them. And for a moment, pride and exhaustion fought quietly beneath the surface, until Lily shifted in her arms with a soft whimper that broke the tension more effectively than any argument could have. Emily exhaled slowly, unscrewing the cap with careful movements, taking a small sip first, then another, the simple act grounding her in a way she had not expected, as if her body remembered something her mind had been too busy surviving to notice. Alexander watched without intruding, his posture relaxed but attentive, giving her space while still remaining present, a balance he had learned in boardrooms but rarely applied to anything beyond business. And yet here it felt different, less calculated, more instinctive, as though he was responding to something older than strategy. "You said the door was open," he said after a moment, not as an accusation, but as a quiet observation, and Emily nodded quickly, her grip tightening slightly around Lily as if bracing for disbelief. "It was not locked," she explained, her voice steadier now, but still cautious. "I did not think anyone was inside. I just needed somewhere warm for her to sleep. Just for a little while." And the way she said it made clear that time had become a luxury she no longer measured in hours, but in moments of safety, however brief. Alexander's gaze shifted toward the entrance, his mind already tracing back the lapse, the oversight that should not have happened, yet his attention returned to her just as quickly, because the explanation itself mattered more than the mistake, and there was no deception in her voice, no attempt to manipulate, only a straightforward honesty shaped by necessity. Lily stirred again, her eyes fluttering open halfway, unfocused at first before settling on Emily's face, and the small smile that followed was immediate, instinctive, untouched by the weight of the world around them, and Emily's entire expression softened in response, the tension easing from her shoulders in a way that revealed how tightly she had been holding herself together. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair away from the child's forehead, her tone gentle, steady, as if nothing around them was unusual at all, as if this room, this moment, was simply another stop in a long, uncertain journey. Alexander noticed the shift, the way the room seemed to change when the child was awake, how the focus moved from survival to connection in an instant, and something about that transition held his attention more than any negotiation ever had. "How old is she?" he asked, his voice quieter now, less formal, and Emily glanced up briefly, surprised by the question but not threatened by it. 6 months, she replied, adjusting the blanket around Lily with practiced care, her movements precise despite her fatigue, and Alexander nodded slightly, as if committing that detail to memory, though he could not explain why it mattered. The silence returned, but it no longer felt tense, no longer filled with uncertainty. Instead, it carried a strange sense of pause, like a moment suspended between what had been and what could come next, and Emily became aware of it, aware that she was still standing there instead of leaving, still inside a space that should have pushed her out by now. And she looked toward the door briefly, then back at Alexander, her expression uncertain but no longer panicked. "We will go," she said softly, more out of habit than intention, and this time, when the words left her lips, they did not carry the same urgency, as if part of her was waiting, just slightly, to see if he would stop her, not with force, but with something else, something she had not yet fully recognized but could already feel beginning to take shape. Alexander did not move toward the door when she spoke, did not step aside or gesture for her to leave, and that absence of reaction created a pause that stretched just long enough to change the meaning of her words. Instead, he remained where he was, his attention steady, his expression unreadable in a way that did not feel cold, only controlled, as if he was considering something far beyond the immediate moment. "You can," he said quietly, not as a command, not as permission, but as a simple acknowledgement of her choice. And Emily felt the weight of that response settle differently than she expected, because he was not forcing her out, and he was not insisting she stay. He was leaving the decision with her, something she had not been given in a long time. She shifted her stance slightly, adjusting Lily against her shoulder, the child now fully awake, her small eyes drifting curiously around the room as if taking in a world entirely new. And for a brief second, Emily followed that gaze, noticing details she had ignored before, the polished surfaces, the quiet hum of temperature control, the kind of comfort that did not demand attention because it had always been there, and the contrast struck her more sharply now that she was no longer half asleep. "I should not have come in," she added, softer this time, less defensive, more reflective, as if speaking to herself as much as to him, and Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of it without amplifying the mistake. "You needed somewhere safe," he replied, and the word safe lingered in the air longer than expected, because it carried more meaning than the room itself, more than the temporary shelter it had provided, and Emily's eyes lifted to meet his again, searching for the intention behind that statement, but finding only a calm certainty that unsettled her in a different way. Lily made a small sound, somewhere between a laugh and a breath, reaching out with one hand toward the light filtering through the window, her fingers opening and closing as if trying to catch something intangible, and the simplicity of that action drew both of their attention for a moment, a shared focus that required no explanation. Alexander stepped closer then, not abruptly, but with measured ease, stopping at a respectful distance that did not invade her space, and he glanced briefly at the bag resting near the edge of the bed, its contents visible enough to tell a story without words, a few folded clothes, a blanket, the photograph he had noticed earlier, nothing excessive, nothing unnecessary. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked, and the question was direct, yet not intrusive, framed without assumption, and Emily hesitated, not because she did not understand, but because answering honestly felt like crossing a line she had learned to avoid. "We will figure something out," she said instead, her tone steady but guarded, and Alexander did not challenge the response, though it was clear he recognized it for what it was, an answer designed to protect dignity rather than reveal truth. He nodded once, accepting the boundary without pushing against it, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet settling again, but this time it felt less uncertain, more deliberate, as if both were aware that something important was forming in the space between words. Then, without shifting the tone, without adding weight to the moment, Alexander reached into his pocket and placed a simple key card on the table beside the water, the motion smooth, unremarkable, yet intentional. "Stay until morning," he said, his voice even, leaving no room for misunderstanding, but also no pressure beyond what was necessary, and Emily's breath caught slightly, not in shock, but in something more complex, a mix of relief and hesitation that she could not easily separate. She looked at the card, then at him, her instinct telling her to refuse, to maintain control by walking away, but Lily shifted again in her arms, settling comfortably against her shoulder, unaware of the decision being weighed, and that small, unconscious trust made the choice feel different, less about pride and more about what came next, and for the first time since she entered the room, Emily did not immediately prepare to leave. Emily did not reach for the key card immediately, her eyes resting on it as if it might disappear if she looked away too quickly. The simple piece of plastic carrying more weight than anything else in the room, not because of what it was, but because of what it offered. And for someone who had learned to expect conditions attached to every act of kindness, the absence of explanation felt almost harder to accept than rejection. Her fingers tightened slightly around Lily, grounding herself in something real, something she understood, while her mind moved carefully through the moment, searching for the part she was missing. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly, her voice steady but cautious, not refusing, not accepting, simply acknowledging the imbalance between them, and Alexander's response came without hesitation, not defensive, not dismissive, just direct. "I know," he said, and that was all. No justification, no elaboration, leaving the decision exactly where he had placed it, with her. The quiet stretched again, but this time it carried a different tone, less uncertain, more reflective, as if both of them understood that something important had already shifted, even if neither of them named it. Lily let out a soft, content sound, her small hand resting against Emily's shoulder, her presence constant and uncomplicated, and Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, just long enough to feel the weight of her own exhaustion without pushing it away, just long enough to admit that she was tired in a way that went beyond sleep. And when she opened them again, her gaze returned to the table, to the card, to the possibility it represented. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward and picked it up, her movements careful, as if accepting it too quickly might somehow take something from her, and she held it for a moment before speaking again. "Just until morning," she said, repeating his words, not as a question, but as a boundary she needed to define, and Alexander inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, respecting the limit without altering it. He turned then, moving toward the window, giving her space not only physically but emotionally, allowing her to settle into the decision without feeling observed, and the city lights reflected faintly against the glass, a distant pattern of motion and noise that felt disconnected from the quiet inside the room. Emily adjusted Lily gently, laying her back down on the bed with a softness that came from instinct rather than thought, her hand lingering for a moment on the child's back until she felt the steady rhythm of her breathing, and only then did she straighten, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, the tension easing in increments rather than all at once. She glanced around again, this time with less urgency, noticing details she had missed before, not as symbols of wealth, but as elements of comfort she had not allowed herself to imagine, and for the first time, the room did not feel like a place she had taken by mistake, but a space she had been allowed to use, even if only for a few hours. "Thank you," she said, the words simple, unembellished, but carrying a sincerity that did not need anything more, and Alexander did not turn immediately, his gaze still on the city, as if considering the distance between where he stood and where she had come from. "Get some rest," he replied after a moment, his voice quieter now, less formal, more human, and the difference was subtle but undeniable. Emily hesitated for a second longer, then moved toward the edge of the bed, sitting carefully beside Lily, her body still alert but no longer tense, and as she leaned back slightly, allowing herself to relax against the softness she had not expected to feel again so soon, she realized that for the first time in days, maybe longer, she was not thinking about where they would go next, not calculating, not preparing, just existing in a moment that did not demand anything from her except to stay, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to be almost overwhelming. The room settled into a quiet rhythm that did not belong to urgency anymore, but to something slower, something unfamiliar to both of them, and as the minutes passed, the distance between action and thought began to widen, giving space for things neither of them had planned to surface. Emily rested against the headboard, her body still alert out of habit, but gradually yielding to the softness beneath her, her hand resting lightly on Lily's back, as if that single point of contact was enough to anchor her in place. And for the first time in what felt like weeks, her breathing matched the calm of the room rather than the pace of survival. Alexander remained by the window, his silhouette reflected faintly against the glass, the city stretching endlessly beyond him, a landscape he knew intimately, yet rarely observed without purpose. And tonight, for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself looking without calculating, without measuring, simply watching as lights flickered and faded in patterns that no longer held his attention the way they once did. Behind him, the soft shift of fabric drew his awareness back, not sharply, but gently, and he turned just enough to see that Emily had closed her eyes, not fully asleep, but close, her guard lowered in small increments, the kind that came only when the body decided it could no longer hold itself upright against exhaustion. Lily lay beside her, one tiny hand resting near her mother's sleeve, her breathing steady, untroubled, untouched by the circumstances that had brought them here, and the simplicity of that trust lingered in the air like something fragile yet undeniable. Alexander took a slow step away from the window, his movements quieter now, less deliberate, guided more by instinct than intention, and he paused near the table, his gaze briefly falling on the photograph again, the edges worn, the image slightly faded, yet still holding a clarity that suggested it had been looked at often, perhaps in moments when memory was the only place that felt consistent. He did not pick it up, did not intrude, but the presence of it alone was enough to suggest a story that did not need explanation. He lowered himself back into the chair, this time with less formality, his posture easing in a way that would have felt out of place in any other setting. And as the silence deepened, it no longer felt like something that needed to be filled, but something that held its own meaning, something that allowed both of them to exist without expectation. Time moved differently in that space, not marked by meetings or deadlines, but by the subtle shifts of breath and stillness. And eventually, Emily's breathing slowed further, her body finally giving in to the rest it had resisted for so long, her hand remaining loosely placed on Lily, as if even in sleep she refused to let go completely. Alexander watched for a moment longer, not out of curiosity, but out of a quiet awareness that this moment, however brief, was real in a way most of his life was not, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze softening, his thoughts no longer pulled in a dozen directions at once, but settling into a single, unexpected realization that did not come with words, only with a feeling he had not recognized in years. Something steady, something human, something that could not be measured or negotiated. And as the city continued its distant motion beyond the glass, the room remained still, holding within it a quiet that neither of them had known they needed until now. Somewhere in the middle of the night, the silence shifted again, not broken, but softened by the quiet rhythm of breathing that filled the room, and Alexander found himself awake without knowing exactly when he had stopped thinking about leaving. The chair beneath him was not meant for rest, yet he had not moved, as if stepping away would somehow disturb the fragile balance that had settled over the space, and for once, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the time, did not measure the hours against anything waiting for him beyond these walls. A faint movement drew his attention, and he looked toward the bed to see Lily stirring, her small face tightening for a brief moment before relaxing again, her hand shifting until it found the edge of the blanket, gripping it lightly as if confirming something was still there. Emily, still asleep, responded instinctively, her arm adjusting without waking, her presence constant even in unconsciousness, and Alexander watched that simple exchange with a focus that surprised him, because there was no transaction here, no expectation, only a quiet, unspoken connection that existed without effort. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms against his knees, his gaze lingering on the details he had overlooked before, the way Emily's hand remained open even in sleep, not clenched, not guarded, just resting. And it struck him that trust did not always announce itself. Sometimes it appeared in the smallest ways, in the absence of tension, in the willingness to let the body finally rest. The room felt warmer now, not because of the temperature, but because of something less tangible, something that had nothing to do with design or luxury. And for a moment, Alexander allowed himself to sit in that realization without trying to define it. His thoughts drifted, not toward work or obligation, but toward a memory he had not revisited in years, a quiet kitchen, early morning light, the sound of someone moving softly so as not to wake him, and the feeling of being cared for without needing to ask. It came and went quickly, but it left something behind, a subtle shift that made the present moment feel less distant from who he used to be. He exhaled slowly, leaning back again, his posture less rigid now, and as the hours moved forward, the line between observer and participant blurred in a way he had not anticipated. At some point, Lily's eyes opened again, this time more fully, her gaze unfocused at first before settling in his direction, and for a brief second, there was no recognition, no understanding, only curiosity, pure and unfiltered, and she did not cry, did not react with fear. She simply looked at him as if he belonged in the room as much as anyone else. Alexander did not move immediately, did not speak, but something in his expression softened in response, an almost imperceptible change that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. And after a moment, he shifted slightly, enough to acknowledge her awareness without disrupting Emily's sleep. Lily made a small sound, a quiet coo that carried no demand, only presence, and Alexander found himself responding in kind, not with words, but with a subtle nod, as if that was enough, as if communication did not require anything more. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, cars moving, lights changing, lives unfolding at a pace he usually dictated. Yet inside the room, time had slowed into something else entirely, something that did not need to be controlled. And as he sat there, awake in the stillness, Alexander realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not waiting for the next moment to begin, because this one, quiet and unexpected, was already enough. The first hint of morning arrived not with sound, but with light, a pale gray slipping through the edges of the curtains and slowly reshaping the room, turning shadows softer, less defined. And as that quiet transition unfolded, Emily stirred again, her breathing shifting before her eyes opened, the kind of waking that came from instinct rather than rest, her body checking her surroundings before her mind fully caught up. Her hand moved immediately, finding Lily beside her, confirming warmth, presence, safety, and only then did she lift her gaze. For a moment, she did not move, her eyes adjusting to the unfamiliar space once more, but this time there was no panic, only a quiet awareness of where she was and how she had gotten there. And then she saw him, still seated across the room, not asleep, not distracted, simply present in a way that felt almost impossible to explain. Alexander had not moved much, yet something about him seemed different in the softer morning light, less distant, less defined by the sharp edges of control that had shaped him the night before. And as their eyes met briefly, there was no tension in the exchange, no immediate need to speak, only a shared recognition that the moment they had entered together had not yet ended. Lily shifted between them, her small voice breaking into the quiet with a soft, curious sound, her eyes opening fully now, bright and alert, and she looked from Emily to Alexander as if connecting the two without question, without hesitation, her world simple enough to accept what was in front of her without needing explanation. Emily pushed herself up slowly, careful not to disturb that calm, adjusting the blanket around Lily before sitting at the edge of the bed, her posture straighter now, more grounded, as if the rest, however brief, had given her something back that she had not realized she had lost. "Good morning," she said softly, the words tentative but sincere, and Alexander inclined his head slightly in response, the gesture subtle yet unmistakably warm. "Good morning," he replied, his voice quieter than it had been in any other setting, carrying none of the authority it usually held, only a steady presence that matched the tone of the room. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it carried a shift, a sense that something needed to be acknowledged, something beyond the immediate moment, and Emily's gaze drifted briefly toward the table, toward the key card still resting where he had placed it, before returning to him, her expression thoughtful, measured. "We should go," she said after a moment, not with urgency, but with acceptance, as if she understood that whatever had happened here belonged to a single night, a brief intersection that could not simply continue without definition. Alexander watched her for a second longer, his attention steady, and then his gaze moved to Lily, who was now reaching outward again, her small hand extending into the space between them without hesitation, and something about that simple gesture paused him, not in uncertainty, but in recognition. He stood then, not abruptly, but with intention, closing the distance between them just enough to be part of the moment without overwhelming it. And as Lily's fingers brushed lightly against his hand once more, he did not pull away. "You could," he said, his voice calm, echoing the same quiet certainty from the night before. "But you do not have to leave like this." And the words settled differently now, not as an offer of temporary shelter, but as something that reached beyond the morning, beyond the room, and Emily felt that shift immediately, her breath catching slightly as she searched his face for clarity, for conditions, for anything that would make sense of what he was saying. But once again, there was nothing there, except a steady, grounded intention that did not ask for anything in return. Emily did not answer right away, and the pause that followed felt heavier than any words could have been, because what he had just said did not fit into any pattern she recognized. It did not sound like an offer she could categorize or protect herself against, and that uncertainty made her cautious in a way that had been shaped by experience rather than doubt. Her eyes stayed on him, searching, not for kindness, because she had already seen that, but for the structure behind it, the reason that would explain why a man like him would say something like that to someone like her. "I do not understand," she admitted finally, her voice quiet but steady, not defensive, simply honest, and Alexander did not seem surprised by the response, as if he had expected it. He glanced briefly toward Lily, who was now sitting up slightly with Emily's support, her attention moving between them without concern, her small hands resting against the blanket as if the moment belonged to her as much as anyone else. And then he looked back at Emily. "You came here because you needed a place to stay," he said, his tone calm, laying out what was already clear. "And you were ready to leave the moment you woke up, not because you wanted to, but because you thought you had to." And Emily felt the truth of that settle in her chest, not as something new, but as something she had not expected anyone else to notice. She shifted slightly, adjusting Lily again, her fingers moving automatically, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm of care, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not require explanation. "That is how it works," she said, her words simple, shaped by repetition rather than choice, and Alexander held her gaze for a moment longer, as if considering the weight of that statement before responding. "It does not have to work that way today," he replied, and there was no emphasis in his voice, no attempt to persuade. Only a quiet certainty that made the statement feel less like an offer and more like a fact he was presenting for her to accept or reject. Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for a second as she processed that, her thoughts moving carefully, measuring not just what he was saying, but what it could mean beyond this room, beyond this morning. And when she looked up again, there was something different in her expression, not trust, not yet, but a willingness to listen that had not been there before. "What are you offering?" she asked, not challenging, not suspicious, simply asking for clarity in a way that allowed him to define the space between them, and Alexander did not hesitate. "A chance to not rush out of another place that you needed," he said, his words deliberate, each one chosen without excess. "A chance to figure out what comes next without having to do it alone in a hallway or a street or wherever you thought you had to go." And as he spoke, there was no mention of money, no reference to status, nothing that would turn the moment into something transactional, only the outline of an option that respected her position without diminishing it. Emily listened without interrupting, her grip on Lily steady, her posture no longer tense but still guarded, and when he finished, the silence returned, not empty, but full of possibility in a way she had not allowed herself to consider in a long time. Lily reached out again, her hand brushing lightly against Alexander's sleeve, and he did not move away, his attention shifting to her briefly before returning to Emily, and that small, unforced connection seemed to bridge something that words alone could not. Emily followed that movement, her eyes softening for a fraction of a second before lifting back to his, and she nodded slowly, not as an answer, but as an acknowledgement that she had heard him, that she was considering something she had not planned for, and that, for now, she was not walking away. Emily remained still after his words settled, not because she had decided, but because she understood that whatever choice she made next would not be temporary, and that realization carried a weight she had learned to approach carefully. Her eyes lowered briefly to Lily, who was now fully awake, her small fingers playing with the edge of the blanket, unaware of the quiet shift happening above her. and Emily brushed her thumb gently across the child's hand, grounding herself in that simple, familiar motion before looking back at Alexander. "Nothing is free," she said softly, not accusing, not dismissing, just stating a truth that had shaped every decision she had made for as long as she could remember, and the honesty in her voice did not challenge him. It simply drew a line she needed him to see. Alexander did not respond immediately, not because he was searching for an answer, but because he understood the meaning behind her words, understood that this was not about skepticism, but about survival, about the way trust had to be measured when it had been broken too many times before. He took a slow step closer, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough to make his presence clearer, more intentional, and when he spoke, his tone remained steady, unchanged. "Then do not treat it like something free," he said, and Emily's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, as she tried to follow what he meant. "Treat it like time," he continued, his gaze steady on hers. "Time to rest, time to decide, time to figure out what you actually want without being forced into the next thing just because you have no other option." And as he spoke, there was no pressure in his voice, no urgency, only a quiet structure that did not take anything from her, only offered space she had not been given before. Emily held his gaze, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly as his words settled into something she could understand, something that did not threaten her control, and she nodded once, slowly, as if testing the idea before fully accepting it. "And then what?" she asked, her voice still careful, but no longer guarded in the same way, and Alexander did not hesitate. "Then you choose," he replied, simple, direct, leaving the outcome entirely in her hands. And that answer shifted something again, because it did not bind her, did not place her in a position she could not step away from. It simply extended the moment into something larger. Lily made a small sound, her attention drifting toward Alexander again, her curiosity steady, unafraid, and she reached out once more, her hand brushing lightly against his sleeve. And this time, Emily did not pull her back, did not interrupt. She simply watched, her expression softening in a way that revealed more than any words could have. Alexander responded the same way he had before, not with exaggerated reaction, not with surprise, but with quiet acceptance, allowing the child's hand to rest there for a second before gently shifting his arm, so she would not lose balance. The movement natural, unforced, and Emily noticed the ease of it, the absence of hesitation, and it stayed with her longer than she expected. The room felt different now, no longer defined by a single night or a single decision, but by the possibility of something extending beyond both. And Emily exhaled slowly, her posture no longer rigid, her mind no longer racing ahead to the next place she had to be. And when she looked at him again, there was something new in her eyes, not certainty, not trust fully formed, but the beginning of it, quiet and cautious, yet real enough to change what came next. And for the first time since she had stepped into the room, she was not thinking about how to leave, but about whether she needed to at all. Emily let the silence stretch after that realization, not because she had nothing to say, but because for the first time in a long while, she did not feel rushed to fill it, and that alone changed the way she held herself, her shoulders lowering slightly, her breath evening out as if her body was slowly relearning what it meant to exist without immediate pressure. She looked down at Lily again, watching the way her daughter's attention moved freely, unburdened by hesitation, her small fingers still lightly resting against Alexander's sleeve. And there was something quietly powerful in that simple connection, something that did not ask permission, did not measure risk, it just existed. Emily reached forward gently, adjusting Lily so she sat more comfortably, her movements calm, no longer hurried. And when she looked back up, her expression had shifted again, not completely open, not unguarded, but no longer defined by the same urgency that had brought her here. "I cannot stay here forever," she said softly, not as resistance, but as a boundary she needed to acknowledge out loud, and Alexander nodded once, immediately, without hesitation, without trying to change that truth. "You are not supposed to," he replied, his tone steady, reinforcing what he had already said, that this was not about keeping her here, not about creating dependency, but about giving her a moment she could step forward from rather than run away from. Emily absorbed that quietly, her gaze drifting for a second toward the window where the city had fully awakened now, the light stronger, clearer, revealing the scale of everything beyond the room. And for a brief moment, the reality of that world pressed back in, the noise, the uncertainty, the constant need to move, to decide, to survive, but it did not overwhelm her the way it had before, not completely, because now there was a pause between that world and her next step, and that pause had been given, not taken. "I need to think," she added after a moment, her voice more certain now, not defensive, simply stating what she needed, and Alexander inclined his head again, accepting that without question. "Then think," he said, just as simply, and the lack of pressure in his response made it easier, not harder, to stay in that moment. Lily shifted again, her attention now caught by the light coming through the window, her small hand reaching toward it as if trying to hold on to something she could not fully understand, and Emily followed that motion, a faint smile touching her expression for the first time, subtle but real, and Alexander noticed it, not as something to comment on, but as something that confirmed what he had already sensed, that beneath everything else, there was strength there, not loud, not obvious, but steady. He stepped back slightly then, creating space again, not retreating, but allowing her the room to move, to decide, to exist without feeling observed, and the gesture was small, yet deliberate enough to matter. Emily stood slowly, lifting Lily with her, holding her close for a moment before shifting her weight comfortably, and she looked around the room one more time, not as someone out of place, but as someone taking in where she was before deciding what came next. Her gaze returned to Alexander, and this time, there was less hesitation in it, less distance. "I will stay until morning is over," she said, defining the moment in her own way, shaping it into something she could hold on to without losing herself in it. And Alexander nodded once more, accepting that boundary without adjusting it, without expanding it, simply letting it stand. Outside, the city continued moving forward, indifferent and constant, but inside the room, the moment held, not frozen, but steady, and for the first time, Emily did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something uncertain, but at the beginning of something she had the space to understand before stepping into it. The morning continued to unfold quietly, not with any sudden change, but with a steady sense of movement that felt different from the urgency Emily had known for so long. And as the light filled the room more fully, she adjusted Lily in her arms and took a slow breath, allowing herself to stand in that moment without immediately planning her exit. There was still uncertainty ahead, still questions she could not yet answer, but for the first time, those questions did not press against her with the same weight. Alexander remained nearby, not watching her directly, but present in a way that did not feel distant, his posture relaxed, his attention no longer divided between a dozen demands, and when he finally moved, it was with quiet intention, stepping toward the table and picking up a simple card, not the room key, but something smaller, something more permanent, and he placed it beside her bag without drawing attention to it, without turning it into a moment that required reaction. Emily noticed the movement anyway, her eyes shifting briefly to the card before returning to him, her expression thoughtful, measured, as if she was taking in not just the gesture, but the way it had been made, without pressure, without expectation. "You said I choose," she said softly, her voice steady, not questioning, but confirming, and Alexander nodded once, his gaze meeting hers with the same calm certainty that had defined every word he had spoken. "You do," he replied, and there was nothing more added to it, no conditions, no timeline, just a simple truth left in her hands. Emily looked down at Lily, who was now resting comfortably against her shoulder, her small head turned slightly as she watched the light shifting across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background, the uncertainty, the decisions, the world waiting outside, leaving only that quiet connection that had carried her through every difficult step before this one. She adjusted her hold on Lily, pressing a gentle kiss to her hair, her eyes closing for a second as if sealing something within herself, not a decision fully formed, but the beginning of one, shaped not by fear, but by the space she had been given to consider it. When she opened her eyes again, she reached for her bag, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with purpose, and her fingers brushed against the photograph inside, the familiar edge grounding her in where she had come from even as she stood in a place she had never expected to be. She picked up the card from the table, holding it for a moment, her gaze moving between it and Alexander, and then she nodded once, a small, quiet acknowledgement that did not promise anything beyond the present, but did not close the door either. "Thank you," she said, the words simple, yet carrying more weight now than they had before, because they were not just for the room, not just for the night, but for something deeper, something she was only beginning to understand. Alexander did not respond with anything elaborate, only a slight incline of his head, his expression steady, as if he understood that this moment did not need to be filled with more than that. Emily turned then, moving toward the door with measured steps, Lily secure in her arms, the world beyond waiting as it always had. But this time, she did not feel like she was stepping back into it alone, not because someone was holding her there, but because she carried something new with her, something intangible yet undeniable. She paused briefly at the door, her hand resting on the handle, and for a second, she looked back, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, and then she stepped forward, leaving the room not as someone escaping, but as someone who had been given the space to begin again, and behind her, Alexander remained still, the quiet returning once more, but this time, it carried a different meaning, not emptiness, but the echo of something that had shifted, something that could not be undone. He owned the suite, every inch of it, every detail designed to reflect control and success. But as the door closed softly, he stood in the silence and realized that for one unexpected night, it had not been his space that mattered, it had been hers, and in giving it to her, even briefly, he had found something he had not known was missing.